Hello, and welcome to Feminism Destroys All. I slay me. Anyway, I'm not going to have this on the entire time. Actually, let me turn it off. Even though it's turned off, I'm still going to use it. Anyway, hello, and today we are going to be talking about the women's rights movement from the 1960s to 1970s. I also kind of want to talk about why it began in the first place. We don't really talk about what even allowed for women to have rights, We just like to think that we've always had them. So, 1960 wasn't just any year. It was the year for women's rights. We had JFK in office, before he got assassinated. We had JFK passing the Equal Pay Act, which prohibited employers from, paying men higher than women. They were like, hey, you kind of have to pay women the same. Although it's still not done perfectly to today. It was, passed. But not just that in 1963, we also had this baddie, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. Now, if you don't know this book, it is written by Betty Friedan. Pretend this is The Feminine Mystique. I don't have a copy. I'm a bad feminist. This book is essentially about the white middle class struggles of women, where essentially it was going about how all these women that went to college and became accomplished, essentially has a comfortable life, how they were dissatisfied with it in the end of the day because they weren't allowed to be anything else other than a wife and a mother. They didn't have any choice in say about their lives. They all had to depend on their husband. And in most cases, especially after World War II, their husbands weren't that great either. They were drunks, they were abusive, and they had no way out of that. So this book really became a rallying cry for women who were dissatisfied with their lives. And a lot of women came together because of it, which allowed for the foundations of the women's rights movement to come into fruition. Now, a year later, JFK passed the phenomenal Civil Rights Act movement law of 1964. That's right, guys. Segregation banned. Discrimination banned. You can't do that based off of color, gender, religion, or place of origin after that. But the passing of this act was a big movement for Black women, especially. Because Black women before this were they were always expected to work. They didn't have the privilege of just staying in the home and, be a wife and a mother. They were expected to work as well on top of, domestic labor. But the passing of the Civil Rights Act allowed for Black women to have more opportunities where they could go and get a higher education, where they would have access to more jobs other than just domestic labor. And it would also allow for them to be housewives and mothers without having to work, because their husbands, due to the Civil Rights Act, would have access to higher paying jobs, which would allow to, support them at the home. Then comes the rise of the women's rights movement in the 1960s, and the later part of the 1960s, to be exact. My textbook for my class, Rebel Created Equal United States History, Volume 2, said, and I quote, I am going to be reading off my computer for this one. Okay. Younger feminists in 1967 and 1968 agreed with Now's challenge. Now is a foundation for women's rights. Challenge to discrimination in the public sphere, but they focused even more on the personal politics of women's daily lives, on issues such as parenting, childcare, housework, and abortion. Ooh. Anyway, so we see the shift going more off from law to challenging the culture of sexism and, discrimination in the workplace and in our lives. Moving on to the 1970s. Oof. Vietnam War, Jimmy Carter, the energy crisis. Oh yeah, women's rights. Women would gain access to birth control, no-fault divorce, abortions, and most importantly, a bank account. Having money without a man interfering on that, okay? Gone are the days where we have to put up with drunks, slobs, and abusers for husbands and fathers, okay? We don't have to rely on them just to live anymore. We can also create not just life. We can create art, research, science, contributions to society itself on our own, without a man, without having to worry about, hey, what does my husband think about this? Hey, what does my father think about this? I think they're gonna make me homeless. I know that I'm grateful for the women who fought for this cause. My grandmother was a teacher, my mom was a nurse. So I come from women who
wanted independence, who've always worked, who've always wanted more for their lives than just a husband and children. You know, they had things of their own. That being said, just because they fought for us then does not mean we don't need to fight now. We need to not just fight for ourselves, but for others as well. Those who can't fight especially. I want to thank y'all for watching this video. This is a project for my history class. So I hope you like this, professor. I hope I did a good job. I would appreciate a no less. I'm kidding, please. I hope I did this with its due justice. I appreciate you taking the time, and I really appreciate this course. I enjoyed writing papers every week, and I hope you liked my papers. This is my final project, and this is me saying over and out.